"You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The words didn't come from anger. They came from certainty, quiet and controlled, the kind that didn't need volume to be heard. And yet no one in that room was ready for what they meant. Not with the low amber lights reflecting off crystal glasses. Not with the soft jazz drifting through a space that smelled like money and power. Not with Victor Liang standing there in a tailored suit that cost more than most people's rent. His posture relaxed. His expression amused, like the moment had already been decided in his favor, like the world always bent his way, because for years it had, because men like him didn't just walk into rooms, they owned them, and people stepped aside without being asked, especially people like Naomi Brooks, a waitress in a pressed uniform, moving quietly between tables, invisible by design, the kind of presence people noticed only when something went wrong. And tonight, something had, a small mistake, barely worth mentioning. A glass set down a second too late. A gesture misunderstood, but in Victor's world, control was everything, and anything that disrupted it became a problem to fix, fast, clean, and public. And so he acted, not out of rage, but out of habit, a sharp motion that cut through the air and froze the room in a single breath, not because of what happened, but because of what it meant, power asserting itself without hesitation, without consequence. Or at least that's what everyone expected, because Naomi didn't react the way they thought she would. She didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she stood still, shoulders steady, breathing slow, as if she had already moved past the moment and was somewhere else entirely, calculating, observing, choosing. And that was when the atmosphere shifted, subtle at first, like pressure building before a storm, because Victor smiled, assuming silence meant submission, assuming the script was still his to control, and maybe it had been, up until that exact second. When Naomi took one step, not back but slightly to the side, a movement so small most people almost missed it, except what followed couldn't be ignored, a sudden imbalance, a misstep, and the man who moments ago filled the room with his presence found himself losing it, not dramatically, not violently, just enough to break the illusion. Just enough for the polished marble beneath his feet to remind him that gravity didn't care about status, and the sound that followed wasn't loud, but it echoed, not because of impact, but because of silence wrapping around it, thick and absolute, every eye locked, every breath held. And then Naomi spoke, her voice even, precise, not raised, not rushed, a single sentence referencing numbers, contracts, and a clause buried deep inside a deal no outsider should have known. And suddenly, the room wasn't looking at Victor anymore. They were looking at her, really looking, as whispers started to form, as recognition flickered across faces that had moments ago dismissed her completely. And somewhere in that shift, something irreversible began to unfold, something no one had planned for, least of all the man who thought he controlled everything. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and sharp, like a wire pulled too tight. And in that silence, Victor Liang stayed on the floor. For a second longer than he should have, not because he could not stand, but because something deeper had shifted, something unfamiliar, something he had not felt in years, uncertainty. And when he finally pushed himself up, adjusting his jacket with controlled precision, the room did not return to him the way it always had. The attention did not snap back into place. The power did not automatically settle on his shoulders. Instead, it hovered somewhere else, drifting, unstable, pulled toward Naomi Brooks, who stood exactly where she had been, calm, unshaken, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had simply corrected a small imbalance in the universe. And that was what unsettled everyone the most. Not the movement, not the fall, but the absence of fear, because fear was expected. Fear was the rule in rooms like this, and Naomi was not following it. A man near the window lowered his glass slowly, his eyes narrowing, replaying her words in his head. The numbers she had mentioned, the clause she had referenced, details tied to a pending acquisition that had not yet been made public, not even to most investors in the room. And suddenly curiosity replaced amusement. Whispers sharpened into quiet questions. Who was she? How could she possibly know that? And Victor heard it. Every fragment, every shift in tone, and for the first time that night. He looked at her not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. and that realization pressed against his composure, subtle but undeniable. He took a step forward, measured, reclaiming space, his voice smooth but tighter than before as he spoke her name from the tag on her uniform, Naomi, drawing it out slightly, as if saying it would restore the balance. But it did not, because she met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not submissive, simply present. And that presence carried weight, the kind that did not come from wealth or titles, but from knowing exactly where you stood, and more importantly, why. The manager at the edge of the room shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible, because the script had broken and no one knew who was directing anymore. And then from across the room, a voice cut in, clear, older, carrying authority that did not need to be announced, calling Naomi by her full name, Naomi Brooks, not with surprise, but with recognition, and heads turned again, faster this time, because the man who spoke was not just another guest, he was someone people listened to, someone whose opinion could move markets by morning, and the way he looked at her was not casual, it was deliberate, almost respectful, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to confirm something he already suspected, and just like that, the balance shifted again, not back to Victor, but further away from him, and closer to a truth no one in that room had seen coming. The name hung in the air longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because of who said it, and more importantly, how it was said, with certainty, with recognition, with a weight that turned curiosity into attention, and attention into tension. And Naomi did not turn immediately. She did not rush to respond. She simply shifted her eyes toward the voice, calm and steady, as if she already knew who it belonged to, as if this moment had been inevitable. And across the room, standing beside a table of silent investors, was Jonathan Reeves, a man whose presence alone could change the direction of a deal, his silver hair catching the warm light, his posture relaxed but deliberate, the kind of man who did not waste words, and yet he had just used her full name, not a guess, not a question, a statement, and the room felt it, the subtle shift from spectacle to something else, something sharper, because now there was context forming where there had only been assumption, and Victor saw it too. The way heads turned again, not toward him, but toward her, the way the center of gravity had moved without permission, and that was something he did not tolerate easily, his jaw tightening just enough to betray the pressure beneath his control, as he stepped forward again, this time slower, more calculated, his voice lower, measured, asking the question everyone was now thinking but did not dare to say out loud. How do you know that information? And Naomi finally moved, not dramatically, just a slight turn of her shoulders, enough to face both men, enough to claim space without asking for it. Her expression unchanged, composed, her voice even as she answered without hesitation, because someone in this room is about to sign a deal worth over $200 million without realizing the liability buried in Section 14, and I thought they deserved to know before it was too late. And the words landed differently this time, not as a surprise, but as confirmation, because now it was clear this was not luck, not a guess. This was knowledge, precise and intentional, and a ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, phones lowered, conversations stilled, attention sharpened, and Jonathan Reeves took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition of something rare, something valuable, as he spoke again, quieter now, almost to himself. I thought it was you. And that single sentence did more than any explanation could have, because it implied history, connection, something beyond this room, beyond this moment, and Victor felt it, the shift from control to uncertainty tightening around him. Because this was no longer a situation he could dominate with presence alone. This was something else, something unfolding outside his influence, and Naomi stood at the center of it, not elevated by wealth, not protected by status, but grounded in something far more dangerous, credibility. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room realized he might not be the one deciding how this story ends. The room did not return to normal. It recalibrated, slowly, carefully, like a system trying to process new data it was never designed to handle. And every eye that once dismissed Naomi now measured her differently, not by her uniform, not by her position, but by the quiet precision of her words, because people in that room understood numbers, they understood risk, And what she had just revealed was not opinion. It was exposure, and exposure carried consequences. Jonathan Reeves stepped closer until he stood just a few feet away from her, his expression no longer curious but intent, as if he was examining something rare and deciding its true value. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the room without effort. "She is right." And just like that, the tension snapped into something sharper, more dangerous, because confirmation from a man like him did not suggest possibility. It confirmed reality, and a low wave of murmurs spread. No longer whispers of confusion, but calculations of what this meant, who was involved, how much was at stake. And Victor Leong felt the shift more than anyone, because the conversation had moved completely beyond him, and for a man who built his empire on control, that loss was not small. It was destabilizing. He straightened his posture, forcing composure back into place, but it did not land the same way. Not now. Not after the room had seen him hesitate, had seen him misread someone he should have understood. And that was when he made a choice, subtle, but critical. He stopped trying to dominate the moment, and instead tried to understand it. His gaze returning to Naomi, sharper now, less dismissive, more calculating, as if he was reclassifying her in real time, not as staff, but as a factor. And Naomi did not look away. She did not soften. She simply held his gaze, steady and unshaken. And that steadiness said more than any explanation could have, because it was not built in that moment. It came from somewhere deeper, from experience, from knowledge earned long before she stepped into that room. And Jonathan turned slightly toward Victor, his tone calm, but edged with something unmistakable. "You might want to review Section 14 before you sign anything tonight." And the implication was clear. This was no longer a private embarrassment. It was a public warning, and the room absorbed it fully, investors shifting in their seats, advisors exchanging glances, the invisible architecture of power rearranging itself in real time. And Naomi stepped back then, just one step, not retreating, but releasing the center she had never asked for, as if her role in that moment was complete, but the impact of it remained, lingering, expanding, because now the question was no longer who she was. It was how many others had underestimated her before tonight, and how many would regret it after the energy in the room did not settle. It evolved, shifting from shock into calculation, from reaction into consequence. And people who had arrived expecting a routine evening of power and negotiation now found themselves in something far more unpredictable. Because once truth enters a room like that, it does not leave quietly. It spreads, it rewrites expectations. And Victor Leong could feel it in the subtle changes around him. The way conversations no longer paused when he moved. The way eyes no longer followed him with automatic respect. The way attention lingered just a second longer on Naomi Brooks, even as she stepped back into her role, reaching for a tray, adjusting a glass, movements precise and professional, as if she had not just altered the direction of a multi-million-dollar decision. And that contrast unsettled him more than anything else, because power, in his world, was supposed to be visible, loud, undeniable. But what she carried was different. It did not demand recognition. It commanded it without asking, and that made it harder to control, harder to predict. And for the first time that night, Victor did something he rarely did. He paused, not outwardly, not in a way most would notice, but internally, recalculating, reassessing, because whatever assumption he had made about her had already proven wrong, and continuing on that path would cost him more than pride. It could cost him leverage, reputation, deals that depended on perception as much as numbers, and perception was already shifting. Jonathan Reeves had not moved far, still within view, speaking quietly with two investors who now glanced intermittently toward Naomi, their expressions thoughtful, no longer dismissive, and Victor understood what that meant. The narrative had changed, and narratives in rooms like this determined outcomes long before contracts were signed. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, then stepped forward again, but this time there was no performance in it. No attempt to reclaim the spotlight. Just a measured approach toward Naomi, who noticed him without turning immediately, finishing what she was doing before meeting his gaze. And in that small delay, another shift occurred, subtle but undeniable, because it placed him in a position he was not used to, waiting, even if only for a second, And when she finally looked at him, her expression remained calm, unchanged, not defensive, not confrontational, simply aware. And Victor spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. Not an apology, not yet, but something closer to acknowledgement, asking her directly where she had learned to read contracts like that. Because no one acquires that kind of insight by accident. And Naomi held his gaze for a moment before answering, not with detail, but with clarity, saying that when you spend enough time being overlooked, you learn to listen more carefully than anyone else in the room. And the answer landed differently than he expected, because it was not about education, not about credentials. It was about awareness, about perspective, something he had never needed to rely on. And that realization settled in, quiet but heavy, as the room continued to shift around them, no longer centered on power alone, but on something far more difficult to ignore. Truth. The words did not fade after she said them. They lingered, settling into the space between them like something undeniable. And Victor Liang felt it in a way he could not ignore, because this was no longer about a mistake, no longer about a moment that could be dismissed or reframed. This was about perspective, about the kind of awareness he had spent his entire career bypassing. And for a man who built success on speed, on decisions made in seconds, on instincts that rarely failed him, being forced to slow down, to reconsider, was unfamiliar territory. And yet he stayed there, standing across from Naomi Brooks, not as a man above her, but as someone trying to understand what he had overlooked. And around them, the room continued to shift, conversations picking up again but softer, more cautious, as if everyone was aware that something fundamental had changed. Jonathan Reeves had stepped aside now, speaking quietly into his phone, likely adjusting positions, recalculating numbers, because in this world information was currency, and Naomi had just introduced a new variable into circulation. And variables changed outcomes. Victor glanced briefly toward Jonathan, then back at Naomi, connecting the pattern, recognizing that this was not coincidence, that she was not simply observant, she was informed, and that realization brought a new question to the surface, one he had not considered before, not who she was, but why she was here, because someone with that level of insight did not end up in a room like this by accident, not in that role, not unnoticed. And Naomi seemed to sense the question before he asked it, because she shifted slightly, setting the tray down on a nearby table with careful precision, freeing her hands, not as a gesture of confrontation, but as one of presence, as if she was stepping fully into the moment instead of passing through it. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was something deeper in it now, something grounded, saying that sometimes the best place to understand power is not at the table, but around it, because people reveal more when they think no one important is listening. And the statement carried weight, not just for Victor, but for others close enough to hear, because it exposed a blind spot none of them liked to admit existed, and Victor absorbed it, not defensively, but thoughtfully, because for the first time that evening, he was not reacting, he was learning, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked a turning point, not visible to everyone, but undeniable to him, because the confidence he carried into that room had been built on certainty, and certainty had just been replaced with something far more valuable, awareness, and awareness demanded change, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. And as the evening continued to unfold around them, with deals still pending, conversations still moving, one thing had already been decided without a single contract being signed: the dynamic of that room, and perhaps more importantly, the understanding of what true power actually looked like, had been permanently rewritten. The night did not slow down, but it no longer moved the way it was supposed to, because something invisible had taken control, something quieter than money and stronger than status. And it followed Naomi Brooks as she returned to her rhythm, lifting glasses, adjusting settings, stepping between conversations that now paused just slightly when she passed, not out of command, but out of awareness, because once people see differently, they cannot unsee it. And Victor Liang noticed every one of those shifts, each subtle hesitation, each redirected glance, each conversation that no longer revolved entirely around him, and it forced him into a position he had never occupied before, not at the center, but just outside of it, observing, recalibrating, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand still, not speaking, not moving, simply watching Naomi as she moved through the room with the same calm precision she had carried all night, unaffected by the weight of what had just happened, as if she understood something he was only beginning to grasp, that power was not proven in a single moment. It was revealed over time, through consistency, through restraint, through knowing when to act and when to step back. And that realization settled into him slowly, replacing the instinct to dominate with something far less familiar: respect, not announced, not visible to others, but present. And as that understanding formed, so did a decision, not about the deal, not about the room, but about how he would respond. Because moments like this did not disappear, they defined trajectories, they shaped reputations long after the night ended. And Victor knew that continuing as he had would only reinforce what had already been exposed, that he had underestimated someone who saw more than he did. And so he adjusted, subtly, deliberately, turning away from the crowd for a brief moment before stepping back toward Naomi, not to reclaim authority, but to acknowledge reality. And when he spoke, his tone carried none of the sharpness from before, only clarity, asking if she would be willing to explain what she had seen in more detail, not as a demand, but as a request. And that shift did not go unnoticed, not by Jonathan Reeves, who watched from across the room with quiet approval, and not by the others who had begun to recognize that the dynamic had changed permanently. And Naomi paused for a fraction of a second before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if deciding whether this moment deserved her voice. And when she nodded, it was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried weight, because it signaled that the conversation was no longer dictated by status, but by substance. And as she began to speak, outlining the risk with calm precision, the room leaned in, not toward Victor, but toward her. And in that shift, something rare took shape, not a reversal driven by force, but a transformation built on understanding. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room was not leading the conversation. He was listening. The explanation did not feel like a performance. It felt like clarity unfolding in real time. Each word Naomi spoke landing with quiet precision, not rushed, not exaggerated, just enough to reveal what others had missed. And as she outlined the risk buried within the contract, the room leaned closer, not physically, but mentally, as if every person present was recalculating their own position, their own assumptions, because what she described was not small. It was structural, a flaw that could ripple outward, affecting timelines, valuations, reputations. And suddenly the conversation was no longer about status or hierarchy. It was about accuracy, and accuracy had its own authority, one that did not need to be announced, only proven. And Naomi proved it with every detail she shared, referencing clauses, conditions, and implications with a level of fluency that did not match the role she appeared to occupy. And that contradiction became impossible to ignore. Jonathan Reeves listened without interruption, his expression steady, absorbing every point. And when she finished, he gave a slight nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but definitive, as if confirming something that had already been decided in his mind. And that single gesture carried more weight than any applause could have, because in that world, validation did not come from noise. It came from recognition, and Victor Liang saw it clearly now. The shift was complete. The room was no longer questioning whether Naomi was right. They were adjusting to the reality that she was, and that realization did something unexpected. It did not weaken him. It redirected him, because for the first time that night, he was not thinking about control. He was thinking about outcome, and outcome depended on truth, not ego. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just enough to signal acceptance, not defeat, but alignment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been present before: acknowledgement. He said that he would have missed it, simple, direct, without embellishment. And the honesty of that statement landed differently than anything else he had said that evening. Because it was not strategic, it was real, and Naomi met it without reaction, without triumph, just a quiet understanding, as if this was never about proving someone wrong, but about preventing something worse. And that distinction mattered. It shifted the tone of the entire room, from confrontation to awareness, from tension to recalibration. And as conversations resumed, they did so with a different energy, more grounded, more deliberate, because something had been revealed that could not be undone. That power without awareness was incomplete, and that awareness could come from places no one expected. And as Naomi picked up her tray again, stepping back in emotion, she did not carry the weight of what had happened. She moved forward as if it was simply another moment, another decision, another quiet correction in a world that rarely paused to notice who was truly paying attention. But now, the night did not end with applause or dramatic exits. It ended the way real change always does, quietly, almost unnoticed by those who only look for noise, but impossible to ignore for those who understand what just shifted. Because as the final conversations settled and the last glasses were cleared, something had already been rewritten in that room. Not contracts, not numbers, but perception, and perception was where power truly lived. Victor Liang stood near the edge of the space now, no longer the center, but no longer disconnected either. His posture relaxed in a way it had not been when the night began, not because he had lost anything, but because he had gained something far more difficult to acquire, perspective. And as he watched Naomi Brooks move through the final moments of her shift, he understood something that had never been taught in boardrooms or negotiation tables, that the people most often overlooked were the ones who saw everything, who heard everything, who understood the room without needing to control it, and that understanding carried a kind of power that could not be bought, could not be forced, only recognized. And across the room, Jonathan Reeves paused before leaving, his eyes meeting Naomi's for a brief second, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them, not of status, but of substance. And that moment, small as it seemed, sealed what the night had revealed, because recognition from the right eyes mattered more than validation from the crowd, and Naomi did not hold on to it. She did not linger in the attention. She simply nodded once and continued, finishing what needed to be done, as if the night had not been about her at all, but about what needed to be seen. And that was the difference. She did not seek the spotlight. She corrected the direction of it. And as Victor took one final look before turning to leave, there was no arrogance left in his expression, no assumption of control, only a quiet respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist, because he knew, whether he admitted it out loud or not, that the most important moment of that evening had not come from power, but from clarity, not from dominance, but from awareness. And that awareness had come from someone he almost dismissed, someone he would have walked past without a second glance. And that realization stayed with him as he stepped out into the cool night air. Because some lessons do not fade with time. They follow you. They reshape how you see the next room, the next conversation, the next person you might have ignored. And inside, Naomi Brooks placed the final glass down, the soft clink echoing in a space that now felt different, not louder, not brighter, just more honest. Because sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that does not need to raise itself at all. And that night, everyone who mattered learned exactly what that looked like.